Hey there, 4th and 5th graders. It's our cute little hamster friend, Humphrey. I am here to read chapters 7 and 8. Let's see what he's up to today. Saye speaks up. On Friday afternoon, Saye's father, Mr. Nasiri, picked us up after school. He had a friendly smile and gentle eyes, but he was as quiet as his daughter. Saye lived in a tall building, so Mr. Nasiri carried my cage up 1, 2, 3 flights of stairs to their clean and quiet apartment. Mrs. Nasiri opened the door for us. She spoke to her husband and daughter, but I couldn't exactly understand what they were saying. "Hummy, hummy," a little voice called out. Saye's little brother, Derek, toddled toward the door to greet me. "Say Humphrey," Saye gently corrected him. "Hummy," he said. The Nasiris put my cage in the living room, right in the middle of a big table. Then they pulled up chairs so they could all sit and stare into my cage. It seemed as if they were waiting for something to happen, so I decided to give them a show. First, I spun on my wheel for a while. Then I climbed up the side of the cage and dived down into the pile of soft paper. They were obviously impressed with my performance and they talked quietly. The funny thing is, I couldn't understand a word they were saying. No wonder Saye got 100% on all her vocabulary tests. She and her family knew a lot more words than I did. They finally went to the kitchen to eat dinner. Later, while the rest of the family watched television, Saye's mother quietly sat by my cage watching me. She seemed nice. Eventually, it was bedtime for the Nasiris, but after the lights were out, Saye slipped out of her room and came back to my cage and whispered to me. I could understand her again. "Now you know my secret, Humphrey," she whispered. "My family doesn't speak English well. Well, my dad does a little, but he's shy about it. Mom hasn't learned any English at all, and Derek's too little." "I understand," I squeaked. "That's why I don't like to talk in class," she explained. "I don't talk like the other kids. I'm afraid they'll laugh at my accent. That happened to me when I was little." "But you don't sound different," I frantically squeaked. "I understand you just fine." Unfortunately, she didn't understand me. All she heard was squeak, squeak, squeak. I guess maybe I have an accent too. "But I have an idea that maybe you could help me teach Mom English," Saye continued. "Glad to help out if I can," I squeaked to her. "You're a real friend," Saye replied. See, she understood me after all. The next day, I dozed until late afternoon when Saye led her mother back to my cage. "Humphrey only understands English, Mama," Saye said. "Speak English. Say Humphrey." Saye's mom looked a little frightened, but she tried. "Humphrey," she said. "Hummy," Derek cried as he raced into the room and climbed onto his mother's lap. "Say, hello, Humphrey," Saye gently instructed her mother. "Hello, Humphrey," Mrs. Nasiri said. I squeaked hello right back, and she broke into a huge smile. "Hello," she said. "Good job," I said. Well, things went swimmingly from then on. In a matter of hours, Saye's mom was saying, "How do you do? Nice to meet you. Would you like some water?" I did, thank you. Even when Saye and Derek left to go to the store with their father, Mrs. Nasiri kept on talking. I let her know I understood what she was saying by wiggling my whiskers and hanging my one paw from the top of my cage. "Good boy, Humphrey," she said. Saye and her father were amazed at Mrs. Nasiri's progress when they returned. The family spent the rest of the evening practicing English. First, Saye pretended to be a guest at the door. She went into the hall and knocked. Her mother opened the door. "Hello, Saye," she said. "Won't you come in?" Then Derek went out and knocked. Mrs. Nasiri opened the door and said, "Hello, Derek. Won't you come in?" He rushed in and toddled right over to the table, shouting, "Humphrey, Humphrey!" Next, Saye convinced her dad to practice English with her mom. "What time is it?" asked Mrs. Nasiri. "What time is it?" Saye corrected her. "Oh," she said, "what time it is?" asked Mrs. Nasiri. "What time is it?" Saye corrected her. Mrs. Nasiri got it right the second time. Then Dad looked at his watch. 7:15, he answered. "Would you like some tea?" Mrs. Nasiri asked. "Yes, please. I would like some tea," Mr. Nasiri announced. Guess what? They had a tea party right on my table. As a reward for all their hard work, I spun my wheel as fast as my legs would go, and they all cheered. Later, after the lights were out, Saye slipped out of her room to talk to me again. "Thank you, Humphrey," she whispered. "My mom says she's ready to go to English class now. But I wish you were the teacher." "So do I squeaked, and I meant it. There were more English lessons on Sunday, and Saye showed Derek how to clean up my cage. Suddenly, the boy began to giggle. "Humphrey poop," he yelled. His English was improving, too. On Sunday night, Saye gathered her family together again. "I want to teach you the American song," she said. Then she opened her mouth and began to sing, "Oh, Say Can You See," by the dawn's early light. I stood up, just like we do in the classroom when the Star-Spangled Banner is being sung, but I'd never heard it sung like that before. Saye had the most beautiful voice in the world. It was like a gentle breeze. No, like rippling waters. No, it was beautiful. If only our classmates in room 26 could hear her, which gave me the start of another idea. But I didn't have time to think about it at all, because soon the whole family was singing the Star-Spangled Banner, and I squeaked right along with them, even on those high notes. When we got back to school on Monday morning, though, I was a little disappointed. Mrs. Brisbane asked Saye how things went over the weekend. "Fine," said Saye, and nothing more. Like Ms. Mack said, you can learn a lot about yourself by getting to know another species. But boy, sometimes it's a lot of work. That Monday, I sat in my cage worrying about Saye for quite a while before I dozed off. When I woke up, I noticed that room 26 had changed. The bulletin board was covered with brightly colored leaves. The tops of the chalkboards were lined with big paper witches, ghosts, and skeletons. Hanging from the light fixtures were black crepe paper bats. And I looked to my right and gasped. A horrible, huge orange face with an evil grin was staring directly at me. I jumped back, my heart pounding. "Hey, Humphrey, don't you like old Pumpkinhead?" AJ whispered to me from his seat nearby. "Look, Humphrey's scared of the little jack-o'-lantern," Garth said. "Scaredy cat, scaredy hamster." I stood up straight and looked as unscared as I possibly could. "Quiet, Garth and AJ," said Mrs. Brisbane. Then she quickly returned to a math problem she was writing on the board. Suddenly, I noticed a little movement in the center of the room, a murmur, a change. I looked over and yes, Saye had her hand up. Everyone noticed it, except Mrs. Brisbane, who had her back to the rest of us. "Mrs. Brisbane?" Heidi called out. Without turning, the teacher said, "Raise your hand, Heidi." Now Heidi had her hand raised as well as Saye. "Well, what is it?" Mrs. Brisbane turned to face the class and was obviously surprised at what she saw. "Yes, Saye," she said. In a loud, clear voice, Saye said, "May I move the pumpkin away from Humphrey's cage?" Mrs. Brisbane looked from Saye to the cage and back. "Yes, I guess it is a little close. Thank you, Saye." Saye rose and hurried to my table to push the ugly jack-o'-lantern away. She didn't say a word, but she winked at me, and I knew what she meant. "Heidi, did you want to say something?" Mrs. Brisbane asked. "Not anymore," she said. Everything went back to normal until the bell rang for recess. As my classmates all scattered and ran toward the door, Garth paused by my cage. "Scaredy cat," he muttered. Then he moved the pumpkin right up against my cage. I puffed up my cheeks as big as I could get them. It was going to be a very long day. Tip 7. When hamsters feel intimidated, they often puff up their cheeks. Chapter 8. Tricks and Treats. Halloween or Halloween or Halloween. I wasn't sure what it was, but I was pretty sure I didn't like it, especially on Monday night after Mrs. Brisbane turned out the lights. That's when those skeletons on the wall took on an eerie glow. The bats hanging from the ceiling began to whirl and twirl, and the smile on that ghastly orange pumpkin face looked more like a wicked smirk. Weird. So I was thrilled when Aldo clicked on the lights. "Whoa, it looks like Halloween in here," he said. As he wheeled his cleaning cart in, he strolled over to my cage as usual and bent down so we were face to face. "So, are you going to wear a costume for Halloween? It's Wednesday, you know. Halloween is when the ghosts and goblins come out to play," he explained. "Eek!" I squeaked. No, it's not scary. It's just fun. All the kids will wear a costume. Richie's going to be a werewolf. So what are you going to wear? Fur coat?" He laughed at his own joke and began his cleaning routine, talking to me as he swept and dusted. I started thinking about this costume thing. Ms. Mack had a costume party once while I was staying with her. People dressed up like kings and pirates and ghosts, and Miss Mac dressed up like a clown with a sparkly pink wig and a funny face. Nobody wore a fur coat. I thought about this costume thing all night and the next day. When Garth threw a piece of wadded up paper in my cage, I wondered about the costumes. When AJ tripped on his way to the chalkboard and Gail didn't giggle, I wondered about the costumes. Even when Mrs. Brisbane called on Saye and she answered her, I wondered about the costumes. And I came up with a plan of my own. On Wednesday, Halloween arrived, and there were no costumes. I was extremely disappointed until Heidi blurted out, Mrs. Brisbane, when are we going to have the party? Raise your hand, Heidi, the teacher told her. Heidi obediently raised her hand, and Mrs. Brisbane called on her. This time, when Heidi had asked her questions, Mrs. Brisbane said, we will have our lessons this morning. After lunch, you may put on your costumes and we'll start the party. I felt happy, and got in a nice nap for the rest of the morning. But I was wide awake after lunch. My classmates returned from the cafeteria, then scurried off into the cloakroom and the bathrooms and returned. But I hardly recognized them in their costumes. Oh, they were wonderful. A dragon, 2 pirates, a princess, a ninja, 2 clowns, a ballerina, a bunny, a cat, thank goodness not a real cat, a baseball player, a mad scientist, a skeleton, the Statue of Liberty, an angel, and a devil. The room mothers came to help with the party. They were both dressed as witches. Still, Mrs. Brisbane was the scariest of them all. She didn't wear a costume, just a button that had the words, "This is my costume," printed on it. She gathered everyone in a circle, pushing all the tables back. Then she announced that the class would be having some treats. But in order to get them, they each had to do a trick. Tell a joke, sing a song, or perform a trick for the rest of the class. Oh, I wish someone had told me. I had figured out the costume part, but what about this tricking for treats? Art, the ninja, stood on his head. He stood on his head so long, Mrs. Brisbane finally had to thank him and tell him it was someone else's turn. Gail, the ballerina, twirled around the room on her toes. Garth, baseball player, told a joke about a witch. Miranda, bunny, sang a funny song about your ears hanging low. It was all very entertaining, except for that fact that I was thinking about something else. But Mrs. Brisbane got my full attention when she called on Saye. Saye was dressed as the Statue of Liberty. She wore a flowing dress and had a crown on her head and a big cardboard torch in one hand. She stared down at the floor as she took her place in the center of the circle. What trick will you do for us, Saye? The teacher asked. Saye still stared at the floor. Sing your song, Saye, sing, I squeaked out as loudly as I could. You can do it, Saye, sing. But, yes, I know all she could hear was squeak, squeak, squeak. But I did my best. I think Humphrey wants to hear from you, said Mrs. Brisbane in a surprisingly friendly tone. Suddenly, without warning, Saye began to sing the Star-Spangled Banner in her clear, sweet voice. Everyone stood up right away, like you're supposed to when they sang the national anthem. Mrs. Brisbane put her hand over her heart, and the other kids too. Well, Pay Attention Art didn't until his mom came over and whispered in his ear. I stood up too, as proud as a hamster could possibly be. When it was over, no one clapped or said a word. It seemed as if those sweet notes were still drifting around the room. That was lovely, Saye. Thank you for sharing your beautiful voice with us, Mrs. Brisbane said. I wish she'd speak that way to me someday. Nice, encouraging, friendly. Anyway, the tricks continued, and after AJ told a few riddles, Mrs. Brisbane looked around the circle and said, Did I miss anyone? That was the moment I'd been waiting for. No one had noticed, but the night before, I'd sneaked one of Aldo's white dusting cloths into my sleeping hut. I had to act quickly. I pulled out the cloth and crawled under it so it completely covered me. Then I stood up and began to shout like I'd never shouted before. Trick or squeak, I cried. Trick or squeak. Miranda noticed first. Look, she yelled, it's Humphrey. I wish I could have seen the faces of my classmates, but it was dark, dark, dark under the cloth. I could hear them, though. First there were gasps, then giggles, then shouts of, look, and Humphrey's a ghost. I continued to squeak my heart out until I heard Mrs. Brisbane's firm footsteps coming toward my cage. Who did this, she asked. Who put that on Humphrey? No one answered, of course, not even me. He could suffocate under that, she said. But he looks so cute, Heidi called out. Mrs. Brisbane didn't answer. She just said, will someone please uncover him? Golden Miranda opened the cage door and whisked the cloth away. Humphrey, you are a riot, she said. Only a riot? Let's be honest here. I was a smash hit. Then the room mother served up cupcakes with orange icing and cups of apple juice, and my classmates played games. Just before the bell rang, Mrs. Brisbane clapped her hands and made an announcement. Mrs. Hopper and Mrs. Patel and I have consulted with one another. We have decided to give the prize for the best trick to Saye Nasiri. Everyone clapped and cheered as Mrs. Brisbane handed Saye a blue ribbon. Saye looked over at me and smiled a beautiful smile. Mrs. Brisbane continued, and we have decided to award the prize for best costume to Humphrey. She walked over to my cage and taped a big blue ribbon to it while my classmates cheered for me. Thank you, I squeaked, but I'm not sure anyone could hear me over all the noise. Thank you all. The bell rang, and the room was soon empty, except for Mrs. Brisbane. As she gathered up her papers to take home, Mr. Morales came in. He was dressed in a cap and gown like people wear when they are graduating. Happy Halloween, Sue. Did you have a good party? He asked. Very, she answered. Somehow your friend over there got hold of a ghost costume and won the prize. See, I told you he'd add a lot to your classroom, he said with a smile. He has livened things up, said Mrs. Brisbane. Joy, joy, joy. I believed she was starting to like me. Just so he doesn't liven things up too much, she added. Poof! My hopes of winning over Mrs. Brisbane's heart crashed to the ground. Mr. Morales and his kids kept asking about me, and then he quickly left. Mrs. Brisbane headed out the door after him. There I was, all alone in room 26 with a bunch of half-torn bats and tattered skeletons hanging around me. As I waited for Aldo to arrive, I saw in the darkening room and pondered my job as a classroom pet. Had I really accomplished anything? Mr. Morales' children seemed to settle down while I was there. Saye's mother began to learn English, and Saye would probably never have sung in front of the class without my encouragement. Still, Mrs. Brisbane was not won over. Neither was Garrett Tugwell, although it seemed as if he had liked me well enough in the beginning. Now he always muttered things at me as he passed by my cage. I noticed that he was the only one in class who didn't cheer when I won the award for best costume. I was still worrying about Garth when the lights temporarily blinded me as Aldo sailed into the classroom yelling, "Trick or treat!" He was wearing his usual work shirt, dark pants, and heavy shoes, but on his face he wore huge glasses with a bulbous nose attached. The center of the glasses had giant eyeballs painted on with circles of red veins. His floppy mustache drooped out from under the nose. "Great costume," I squeaked. "Hey, what's this?" Aldo rushed forward to examine my blue ribbon. "Best costume for a fur coat. I'll have to ask Richie about that," he said. Aldo reached into his lunchbox and pulled out a juicy slice of apple. "I've got a special Halloween treat for you, Humphrey, because I'm very, very happy tonight," he said. I grabbed the apple and began nibbling as Aldo pulled his chair up close to my cage. "You see, I went to the Moonlighters Club. You remember the club in that ad I found on the projector?" I squeaked an excited yes. "And I met a real nice girl there named Maria. She works all night at the bakery, so tomorrow we're going out on a date, lunch, and a movie." Aldo leaned back in his chair. "She's a real nice girl. Pretty nice. Did I tell you she works in the bakery?" Aldo rose and paced back and forth in front of my cage. "You know what I can't figure? I can't figure out how the ad got on that projector. Mrs. Brisbane wouldn't show that to the class, and she wouldn't be interested herself. And it was weird how the projector was left on. Mrs. Brisbane always leaves her room in ship-shape condition." He paused to rub his chin, then looked at me out of the corner of his eye. "You know, if you weren't locked up in a cage, I'd think you had something to do with it," he said. Then he laughed. "Well, whoever it was, I owe them a big thank you." "You're welcome," I squeaked. Too bad Aldo didn't understand me this time. Tip 8. Hamsters are most active during the evening. Okay, so a lot of stuff going on in chapters 7 and 8. The English about Saye, that would be something to write about, right? Chapter 8, the Halloween party. Lots of exciting stuff. The costume, the singing, all sorts of good stuff. You'd probably want to put in a notebook if you were taking notes for Battle of the Books. All right, see you guys next week.